My name is Jerm. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas. We were just joking a moment ago about the difference between US and British English. And I mean, I know you like language and words and that kind of thing. So supper and dinner. So you say dinner, right? Is that what you said?
Here in Southern California, yes, I say dinner.
Now, as I understand it, there is actually a difference between the two. I don't know what the difference is. I just know that if I eat food at nighttime, then the term is supper. We don't say dinner, really.
Well, I think I'm not an expert on supper and dinner, but I think supper is earlier than dinner.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, but where I was actually going is I read something very interesting last week that the Americanization of the English language was deliberate by a man named Webster.
That would not surprise me. And if I found out that Webster was a Freemason, that wouldn't surprise me either.
I haven't looked that up, but I'm sure there's something there.
But you're hitting the whole note about what I write about, which is epistemological warfare and changing
the epi-war.
Yeah, the epi-war. If you change the meaning of words, you change the belief of the people who are using those words.
Well, this is exactly it. I was watching a trigonometry episode a few days ago. I don't know if you know trigonometry, the British podcast.
No, I was thinking about the math class that I never took, but go on.
No, it's so they call it trigger, not trigo, or like trigger as in to get triggered. I think that's how you spell. Actually, I don't even know how you spell trigonometry. Is it with an O?
That's a good question. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I can Google it if you'd like.
Peter, we don't use Google. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay. Oh, all right. The funny thing is, though, that you bring up you might not have known this about me, but I ran e-commerce at Virgin for 5 years, and it was very and so I worked with people from all over Great Britain, from London, City of London, okay, which is a different dialect. A lot of people don't realize that. And Wales, Scotland, Ireland, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. I worked with people from all over the Commonwealth. And Winston Churchill famously said once that the United States and Great Britain are two countries that are separated by a common language. And I wound up spending most of my career at Virgin doing nothing more than translating from one group of English-speaking people to another set of English-speaking people all sitting at the same table, because we would use words thinking that the other people who spoke the same words meant the same thing that we meant.
That's interesting.
And they don't. I'll give you one quick example. When the Virgin Megastore Online was launched, the online e-commerce site did not have the ability to reduce prices for a certain amount of time on a specific piece of merchandise. In the United States, we call that a sale. And when the developers were building the website before I was engaged, the president of Virgin Mega Online was a guy, a barrister from the City of London. And when they asked him if they needed, the developers asked the president of the Virgin Mega Store Online if they needed to build a function that would allow us to merchandise, basically lower the price of something for a limited amount of time. They used the word sale, and he said, "Oh no, sales are absolutely not in the Virgin culture. We don't do that." And they were so concerned about it that they actually filled out a memo and they made him sign it. So when then I got hired, and then when the website went live, the new general manager wanted to do what he referred to as a campaign. And a campaign in English is the same as a sale in American English. And we didn't have the ability to do that. the developers didn't build that functionality into the website, and so it became a big kerfuffle. But at that point, I realized that I needed to make sure that the people from England understood what the people from America, that the people from New Zealand were that we were all saying the same thing, because in many cases we weren't.
Well, what I was going to say about Trigonometry, the podcast, is I was listening to a conversation they were having with some woman who, I can't remember exactly, it was a clip, but she was arguing something along the lines of men becoming women and women becoming men. And they were saying, well, a man has a pretty obvious identifier and a woman has a pretty obvious identifier. And these identifiers have been fairly accurate for 99.9% of the time throughout human history. When a baby comes out, you have a look there and you go, okay, it's a boy or it's a girl. And that's pretty accurate. And she's like, okay, but what are we talking about when we are we talking about, chromosomes and zygotes? And what happens is, in the conversation, it becomes so frustrating because she atomizes absolutely everything that you end up with nothing. And so when we talk about a man or woman, she says, well, we need to clarify, what do you mean when you say a man? And that is part of the epi-war, isn't it?
It is. And I think that identifying it is the first step to doing something about it. I just got finished writing a chapter on liberty, and there's a philosopher who taught at Oxford named Isaiah Berlin, who I don't agree with him on many things, but one of the things that he points out in this, he wrote this paper called his two definitions of liberty, and in that essay he points out that he did a survey of different ways that the word liberty is used, and he found over 200. Before I got to Berlin, I had found 15 at that point. And the problem with it is that liberty is a very specific word. If you go back and look at the root form of where it came from, it's a Latin word. And you started this by talking about English, and I think English is interesting because English is kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different languages. And liberty comes from Latin. Freedom actually comes from Germany. And they have two completely different meanings. And yet there was a guy named Stuart Chase who wrote a book called, I think, The Tyranny of Words in 1938. And he points out that if you look in the Webster's dictionary, that if you look under the definition of freedom, it says liberty. And if you look under the definition of liberty, it says freedom. And what's troubling about that is that they don't mean the same thing. Freedom is an internal state where you act on in an unrestricted way. Liberty always has a grantor that's associated with it. That is, slaves are liberated from slavery, so they were the property of a master at one point, or an owner.
Hold on. Okay, I get what you're saying. Sorry for interrupting, but if a slave can be liberated, can it be argued that while enslaved, he was free?
Well, the way that I like to look at it is that if you think of liberty as a form of slavery, then the amount of liberty that you have is merely the length of your chain. And so, but when, and it gets really kind of crazy when you start to take a look at the epistemic machinations. I'm using big words there, but when you start to look at the way that words are messed with in the word liberty is messed with in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, because they're not because the same word appears in both documents, people assume they're being used the same way. And I can tell you unequivocally, they are absolutely not used the same way. In the Declaration of Independence, liberty is the grantor of the liberty is the laws of nature, and nature is God. So there is a transcendent grantor of liberty in the Declaration. And in the Constitution, the grantor of liberty is, quote unquote, the people, or the people who signed the Constitution of the United States of America. But the Constitution becomes the law and the dispenser of liberty. And so there is a metaphysical disconnect between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that American kids in school, and it doesn't matter what school you're in, elementary school or you're getting a master's degree, we're all taught that these documents complement each other. And it's my argument that they don't.
Yes. So you argued recently that the American school system, and I would venture out and suggest that it's not just the American school system, but it's maybe the entire Western school system, because I don't know anything about Asia or that side of the world, but I'll say Western. And to some degree, we are somewhat Westernized down here in South Africa. You argue that there's a difference between, let me just get this right, learning and education.
There are other people who make that argument. The argument that I make is there's a difference between, because I get more granular. I think that there's a difference between thinking and knowing.
Right.
And I to my knowledge, I'm the and again, as soon as I say this, there'll be 5 other authors that said this 100 years ago that I'm not aware of. But I'm writing in my book about the fact that our education system has substituted our ability to think with our ability to know, and then because we are given a piece of parchment with a small foil stamp on it, we're told that we're an expert in something, and in reality, knowing a lot of stuff doesn't necessarily give you the ability to negotiate the world when what you know doesn't line up with what's actually really going on. And I think probably what happened in 2020 is the best example of that. A lot of people were knowing their way through that crisis without thinking. And I think that if you take a look at the people who pushed back against the nonsense that was going on in 2020 and 2021, basically you had critical thinkers versus knowers.
There's a quote that I'm reminded of. I've got it here in front of me just so that I don't butcher it. But the person is Horace Mann, and he said, "Men are cast iron, but children are wax."
Yeah, but yes, and there's a lot missing in between there, because I think that our ability to think cannot be taken away from us. And what the education system winds up doing is that it teaches us to replace our thinking with knowing and to become dependent on it. And often in a moment of crisis, I'm using the English word crisis, not the Greek word crisis, which simply means discernment. Then we're perplexed. We wind up not being able to figure out what to do about it. And that's why I like to say that you can think your way out of not knowing, but you can't know your way out of not thinking. And part of the way that is accomplished, back to Horace Mann, is that our education system, and again, I've been digging deep on this for 5 years, and it's what I've been writing about. There are a lot of words in Greek that indicate a ongoing internal process. The best example off the top of my head is consciousness, right? To be the Greek word for consciousness is something called syneidesis, which means moral co-awareness, or an ability to recognize that you are of the world and not the world. You're a separate entity in this bigger thing. And that's an ongoing process. It's not something that you can put on a shelf, but in English, we can take a word like consciousness and then turn it into a noun. And once you take a verb, an internal verb, process and turn it into a noun, people can externally control that. So I can get you to subscribe to my Substack for $19.95 a month, and I will teach you how to achieve higher consciousness. At that point, it becomes an object, and then you can that object can be manipulated, it can be legislated, it can be educated. There's all kinds of things that you can do in order to control people when you take a God-given internal process and then you turn it into a noun. And I think that that's largely what's happened with our education system. So when you say that kids are whacks, we've all had this experience in life where a little kid, you've got young kids, right? You've got one, at least one, and one on the way, right?
That's correct. Yes.
And as a parent, you're always, and always is a universal quantifier, but as a parent, we are always presented with a situation where our kid, filled with inquisitive energy, asks us why. Why is this? So the anecdote that I use in my book is that there's this little girl and she's walking along a stream bed with her mother, and she picks up a stone and she says, "Why is this one white?" And her mother says, "Oh, it's something to do with the minerals." And then the kid says, "Well, why do the minerals make it white?" And so the kid pushes through the first question. That inquisition, and that's what I call our logos, which is our ability to discern reality in order to use language, in order to challenge assumptions, and to move our consciousness into a more aware, to become more aware of the truth. Right? What is it that actually makes something true? And the education system basically buries that. You spend 15 years in school having them pile stuff on top of that. And in most cases, our natural inquisitiveness gets buried by things, right? And so, yes, but what Horseman left out is that the wax is still underneath there. And that if you peel back, what did he say, bronze? What metal did he say? Was it bronze?
No, I've now lost it. I've moved out the way. Oh, you said cast iron.
Cast iron. Okay. The wax is still there under the cast iron. And the reality is that we can still get to the wax. And that's the good news. I think the good news in all of the terrible things that are going on today is that no matter what they do to us, every human being is born with this logos, this ability to discern truth. And we simply have to recognize that we have it in order to be able to turn it back on. And most people through the education system have been fooled into believing that they don't have it. But like, Dorothy at the end of The Wizard of Oz, where she clicks her heels 3 times and says, "There's no place like home." Or Jennifer Connelly in the movie Labyrinth with David Bowie. She gets to the middle of the labyrinth and there's a mirror there in the middle of the labyrinth. We all have it. We all have this ability. And we just have to recognize that we have it.
So I brought Horace Mann up because he's effectively the father of the American education system. And you argue that American schooling was never designed to make kids smart. It was based on a military system.
Yeah, the Prussian military system. I haven't studied Horace Mann that much. Mostly, I looked at John Dewey and his handlers, because the American education system was largely, at least higher education, was constructed, architected by the Skull and Bone Society out of Yale. I got to pull my glasses forward a little, or I'm going to fog up here. I think it's a little warm, and for some reason, it's getting warm here in Oxnard, California. Anyway, the Prussian so the Battle of Jena is a very interesting battle that happened, I think, 1806 in Prussia, and the Prussians were defeated by Napoleon. And two things happened in 1806, which was that the elector, I think it was the elector of Prussia, or whoever the head guy was in Prussia, said, "How did this happen? We have the most educated, erudite military in the world, and Napoleon bested us. How did that happen?" And at the same time, Meyer Amschel Rothschild what became the financial executor for, I think, the Landgrave of Hesse, so these two events happened at the same time, which is interesting. So the Rothschild Empire was created at the same time that the Prussian reaction to education. So there was a guy named Fichte. I'm trying to remember Fichte's first name. And he gave a series of lectures called Addresses to the German People in Berlin, where he basically said that the education system had failed Prussia because the soldiers were critical thinkers, and that because they were critical thinkers, they weren't going to put themselves in a situation where they thought they were going to die. And so they weren't obeying orders the way that they should have been obeying orders. And that's why the Prussians lost the battle. Which is interesting because as the words are coming out of my mouth, I'm thinking about the current trope about Nazi German soldiers always following orders, right? That became the thing that they were famous for.
Yeah, that is a trope.
Right. And so they they reorganized the education system. They put people in rows. They started having they split all of the disciplines into separate classes. They used Pavlovian bells in order to create periods. These are all operant conditioning methodologies, and started slowly but surely changing the curriculum of all of the different disciplines, all the different subjects, to be able to kind of put people into silos where they became specialists, which is why it's so easy today, I think, for people to become complete experts in one particular specialty and then be complete idiots in others. I mean, my father was a physician. He was an MD. And one of the things that I learned as a kid growing up, and I have other friends whose fathers were physicians, so it wasn't just me and my dad, but for whatever reason, MDs are really, really bad at finance. Like they make a lot of money, and then their ability to actually do something smart with it escapes them. And that's an interesting phenomenon, but I think that that's kind of the natural outgrowth when you have people who are super specialized in one thing, and then they kind of, to the exclusion of the rest of the world.
There was a book published in 1918 called Principles of Secondary Education by, I think, a Harvard professor, and he laid out 6 functions of schooling, none of which had anything to do with learning.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that did you bring up the difference between the word schooling and the word education? I mean, school is in and of itself connotes, a bunch of fish, that are all swimming in the same direction. And I think that is the point of our education system at this point. It certainly took me a long time to unlearn a lot of the things that I just took for granted and assumed.
Well, here are the 6 purposes of schooling that are in that book. Adjustive, which means to train children to obey authority reflexively without thinking. Integrating, to make children as similar and uniform as possible. Diagnostic, to test and evaluate children to figure out where to place them in the social hierarchy, differentiating to train each child only for their assigned role and never above it, selective to push out the unfit so that the system doesn't have to deal with them, and I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that last one, propedeutic, is that right? To train a small elite to manage and govern everyone else.
Yeah, well, that is right in line with what John Taylor Gatto wrote several years later. He was the New York City Teacher of the Year and then the New York State Teacher of the Year. And then he quit the system at one point, and he wrote a bunch of books about how the system was designed to do exactly as you're describing there. So it's not a surprise to me. The system is not. The system is designed, and Andrew Carnegie, I think, wrote about this too. Carnegie and I think that the way the split went down is that Rockefeller basically took care of higher education generally, and Carnegie focused more on like elementary and secondary education. But their intent was to change the curriculum of the American education system. And I think that wound up becoming a model for the rest of the world at that point, in order to turn us into good workers and good soldiers. I don't think that it's arguable that the United States has a great military. I mean, at least let's say great, effective. Let's just say it's got a very effective military. And I don't think that you get to that level of effectiveness if you haven't conditioned your population in a certain way, because I don't think that there's something intrinsically better about North American males than other parts of the world. But even before they ever get to boot camp, their conditioning is already aligned that way.
Yeah, what you just said there is very interesting. You said effective, because the word great is almost like a moral judgment, and it never has a negative connotation to it.
It can. I think that you've made a good point, which is that it is kind of an empty word. And certainly it's become emptier since Make America Great Again became a slogan. But, jumping back to Stuart Chase again, there's a lot of words in our language that are empty. That is, that they don't have a referent. They don't, let me drink some water. Hang on a second. There was a hypnotist named Milton Erickson, and Milton Erickson discovered that human beings will fill in their own definitions to words like great if you leave them undefined. And so an expression like make America Great Again winds up becoming, Make America Great Again becomes a catch-all phrase that anybody who is dreaming of past glory will fill in their own definition of what great means. And so if you don't get people to define what great is, then it winds up becoming this catch-all idea. I think that Barack Obama did the same thing with hope and change. Hope for what? Change what? These are these words don't have references. They're not
populism.
Yeah. Well, again, populism is a word that, depending upon how you define it, has a different connotation, because there are some people who think that populism means, oh, this is what the people want. That if you're a populist, that's what it means. If you're not a populist, then the word populist means idiot. Somebody who's and I use the scientific form of the word idiot, somebody who is following a trend because everybody else is following that trend. And so language winds up becoming the minefield that we have to negotiate the world with. And what's curious is that, you and I are using language right now in order to communicate about how language is a weapon. So it's fun.
But what I meant by the term great is that you never use it in a negative sense. You don't talk about a great serial killer.
You could talk about a great deal of damage. You can talk about.
Oh, okay, fine, sure. Okay, I get your point.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wide open word, but I think that you're making the best point, which is that if you don't, it's like liberty. If you're talking about liberty and you're not talking about who the grantor is, then, and you're using it as freedom, interchangeably as freedom, as Tulsi Gabbard did in a speech at the Young Americans for Liberty conference, and nobody called her out on it. Okay, so it's not only that Tulsi Gabbard was using liberty and freedom as synonyms, but she was at a Young Americans for Liberty conference and nobody called her out on it. So to me, that's the tell. But jumping back for a second, if you're using liberty and you're not saying this is the liberty that's afforded to you by the federal government. And the reason why it winds up becoming dangerous is because there are a lot of people who believe that the Declaration of Independence is actually a functioning vehicle in the United States of America. And in fact, there's people all over the world who believe that that is the reason the United States is quote unquote great, right? But the Declaration of Independence has no force of law. Because the liberty in the Declaration of Independence is granted by A, the laws of nature, and B, nature's God, neither one of whom you can call into a courtroom, then the de facto law of the United States of America is the Constitution, and whatever liberty that you have is derived from the Constitution. Ironically, I just discovered this recently. After the Revolutionary War, the soldiers that fought in that war were given basically IOUs that with a dividend because the country had no money, and then they started raising taxes in all of the colonies, and the legislatures in the colonies were requiring that the farmers pay their taxes in either gold or silver because the country, the United States federal government, had no gold or silver, and they were asking the states. The states were taxing the farmers because ostensibly at that point most of the United States was farms, and they didn't have any gold or silver, and so they wound up having to sell their IOUs for pennies on the dollar to people who did have money. Well, it turns out that the people who did have money were the officers from their army who had organized themselves into something called the Society of the Cincinnati. The first president of the Society of Cincinnati was George Washington, and I think that Alexander Hamilton was the vice president. And so these guys, they were all wealthy. They started buying up all of these IOUs, and as a matter of curiosity, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution of the United States of America stipulates that the federal government does not have the power to revoke contracts. It has no ability to revoke contracts. And what's interesting about that is that if you look at the original definition if you go back 4,000 years to the definition of the word liberty, amargi, is the root form of liberty. It's where it comes from. It means debt forgiveness. And so the farmers revolted when they were being taxed. And it turned out that the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was a direct result of this revolution that was called Shays' Rebellion. And this guy, Daniel Shays, organized these farmers because he felt like they fought a war, they beat the British, They were given IOUs, and then they were asked to pay their taxes in gold and silver. But the federal government wouldn't take their IOU for taxes. And that's what wound up creating that rebellion. And so the definition of words winds up becoming really important, knowing that your liberty in the United States of America does not come from the laws of nature and nature's God, as it says in the Declaration of Independence. There is no court in the land that will support that. And so if in fact that is not the case, then why do we get taught that in school? Why do pundits all over the spectrum of news broadcasts claim that the Declaration and the Constitution are complementary documents? Because they're not.
Could the counter argument be, well, Peter, words change? You mentioned 2020 earlier. I had a discussion with a doctor friend of mine recently in which he said, but we must remember, a vaccine is not meant to give you immunity to a disease. Now, that's exactly what the definition was for a very long time, but the CDC changed it.
That's what my father would have told you. And again, I would say that's a form of epistemological warfare. And that's why we need to understand it for what it is, okay? When you change meaning, you change belief. And so if you change the meaning of the word vaccine, you change what people believe about it, okay? So, and when you force that meaning change through a crisis like that, it is obviously a form of propaganda. It is a form of epistemological warfare. Epistemology is a big, long word that simply means, how do I know that is true? And when you change the meaning of a word, you change the belief of the people who are using that word. So I would just call the doctor and say, I reject that. I reject that the definition of the word has changed. I would say that that's politics. There's a word in linguistics called hermeneutics. And hermeneutics means the politicization of a translation. That is, when you translate the word virus, meaning something that keeps you from getting a disease, to the definition of the word virus, something that doesn't prevent you from getting the disease, then that's a hermeneutic.
Well, the word virus itself has changed plenty times over the last few hundred years. It used to mean toxin or snake venom, I think, originally.
I think you're right. Yeah, because it's the same root form as viper.
And now it has no connection to the original meaning anymore.
That's right. And that's why here's one of the great things about linguistics is that when you start to think about the definition of words and the meaning of words and how those meanings affect your belief, you cannot help but starting to think critically, because the questions that you're asking me right now are critical thinking questions. And forcing people to define the words that they're using is a form of self-defense.
But it's also a game in a way, because if someone says these days that viruses don't exist, and I'm sympathetic to that argument, but I could also turn around and go, hold on, but they do, because snake venom exists.
Yeah, snake venom is a poison, and I think that again, I'm probably along the same line of you. My father is a physician. I grew up thinking viruses are real. I understand.
But what do we mean by that? No, but now we're going into the meaning. What do we mean by that? And which epoch are we referring to?
Yes, and we could probably do a whole show just on that, right? And I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question, but my point is that I understand the argument that people like Sasha Latypova make. Like, I get her argument. I also have certain questions about certain circumstances where it does seem like viruses do exist. So, and I'm not sure how she would answer those. again, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. The point is that having the conversation about it ultimately winds up becoming about how much power we were talking about liberty earlier. How much liberty are you willing to allow the government to take from you because of something that has a moving definition? If you think of liberty as the chain and the government is holding it, there's probably legitimate reasons for quarantines seem to be an effective way to keep disease from spreading at a certain point. Okay. We can argue about what the mechanisms are that are happening to the individuals that are being quarantined, but the quarantine did work, right? So, that quarantine is an abridgment of liberty, right? When you quarantine somebody, you take their freedom away from them. You put them in a box or a jail cell or whatever it is that you do with them. And likewise, that was done to every human being on the planet in 2020. The fact that the definitions of the words were changing is metadata, right? It winds up becomes the evidence. Hey, if you're changing the definition of the word in order to abridge my liberty, then we should start talking about that. Like, I don't think that you should be allowed to change the word. There's so much law. There's so much law that's based on the definition of words. If you have a whole body of law that's based on the definition of a virus being and then you change the law, there's ripple effects on that, right? You change the way that those things impact jurisprudence all over the whole world by simply changing the definition of a word. Well, it shouldn't be allowed.
Well, the WHO changed the definition of pandemic in 2009.
Right. Who elected them?
The member states, I'm guessing, the almost 200 countries around the world.
Right. Yeah. I look at the WHO as like this unelected body that managed to.
No, I agree with you. With you, but we're talking about a pretty powerful authority changing the definition of a word. Now suddenly doesn't mean what it did 20 years ago.
Yeah, I don't believe that should be something that people in power should be able to do.
The thing, though, Peter, is I hate hearing the counter argument when people say, yes, but the science evolves or words evolve, language evolves, right? We don't speak Shakespearean anymore. We use the word emoji. That wasn't a word that existed 20 years ago, right? And yes, that is true. Ideas evolve also, don't they? But if we apply that to a logical end, then nothing means anything.
I don't think, I think evolve and emerge are BS words.
Oh, okay. Well, all right, hold on. Explain what you mean by that.
That evolve or emerge are words that take large, complicated processes that oftentimes people have no explanation for. And then they use it as a suture or a Band-Aid that they put over two events. You say languages evolve into this. You've done a few things there. First of all, you've used language as a complicated process and you've nominalized it. Again, you are a product of our education system. So
but hold on. Am I not correct when I say we don't speak Shakespearean English anymore?
To think about it. It's funny because I read the Bible with my wife every morning. I read a chapter of the New Testament, chapter of the Old Testament, and there's so much Shakespeare that comes out of the Bible. Just the phrasing and the terms of art and things like that. So I would argue that the language has changed, and There are reasons why it changes. I could point to like mercantilism or trade as groups of people start interacting from multiple parts of the world. They start picking up terms, words, terms of art for doing particular things, and they get picked up in today is my biggest concern about doing the podcast at the time that we're doing it today is that I know that the garbage truck is going to come at a certain point. I don't know if in England they call it rubbish, right? I don't know what you call it in South Africa.
We use both.
But yeah, because you probably kind of a mix of Americans and Brits, but so we languages change. My argument would be that I think that there's a process that when we change our mind about something, that we have a belief, and our old belief dies and becomes resurrected and reborn as a new belief. And so there is actually a passion that we all go through whenever we change our mind. And so I think that our minds can be changed about things, but I don't think that those things evolve. That is, the problem with the word evolve or evolution is that it assigns an invisible agent to that change. And when you start turning events over to invisible agents, it becomes hard to manage them because you don't know who to blame or where to put your finger as far as doing something about it.
It becomes unfalsifiable.
Yeah, and that's the boundary condition for me. I've had to come to that place, which means that if I run up against something that's unfalsifiable, I immediately put my hand up and say, "Hold on a second. I'm not sure how far down this path I'm willing to go anymore." Because the unfalsifiability of it winds up becoming the metadata. But a lot of people don't have that critical ability. They haven't developed that critical ability yet. Everybody has the ability to develop it, but most people don't exercise it. Back to your original point, because we've been educated out of it.
So I am a varsity dropout, and I'm beginning to think more and more that was a good thing.
Yeah, I was a computer science major in college, and I dropped out in the end of my second year because I wanted to be a fashion photographer. And I did that for 12 or 13 years before technology dragged me back in. It turned out that the 2 years in college that I had were what I needed in the early 1990s in order to jump into this thing called the internet. But later I found out that I dropped out of school exactly the same time Bill Gates did.
Where did you go wrong?
I'm not sure that I went wrong. I feel.
I'm only kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
Yeah. I feel blessed.
Yes, I also do. Because I do wonder. So I don't know if you know that British educator who was knighted. What's his name now? Ken Robinson, I think his name is.
Yeah. Yes, I remember. I remember liking him back in the day, but I don't remember why I liked him.
So yeah, I mean, I watched a few of his TED Talks back in the day when TED Talks were still something, worthwhile. And I don't know if he's even alive today. I know nothing about him now, but I remember watching a particular TED Talk of his, which always stayed with me. And he said that the entire schooling system is completely useless. Why do we spend 12 years in school? And then he says, well, the reason why we do that is so that we can become prepared for another 3 years at university. And then we are still not prepared for anything. So we have to go further. The whole thing is just completely redundant.
Well, no, he's absolutely right. And it's funny that he became knighted and then nothing changed. The people who understand the system, who are lucky enough to have figured this stuff out before they had kids are able to figure out how to either homeschool their kids or at least try to mitigate the damage that public education does to children. But I didn't see a big change happen in the education system in Great Britain. I mean, to my knowledge, nothing changed after they made him a knight. The same way. I mean, John Taylor Gatto is kind of the American version of him, and yet the only people who are impacted are the people who have decided that they're going to take their kids out of the education system, and then it's funny because I mentor this kid, and he basically was homeschooled almost his entire school career, academic career, but he wanted to swim, and so he started going to public school the last 2 years that he was in school, and now he's going off to university because he wants to keep swimming. I mean, that's kind of the thing that he wants to do, and I understand why he wants to do it, but I'm conflicted as somebody who's advising him. Because I want him to pursue his dreams and do what he wants, but he's also a critical thinker, and I fear that his critical thinking will be robbed from him by going into that system.
Matthias Desmet said to me back in 2020, I think it was, and most people don't even know his name anymore, but he wrote a book on totalitarianism, and nothing necessarily novel. I mean, his work is kind of it's based on the work of other authors, but in my view, still quite good. And he said to me on my podcast that approximately a third of all people at any time will be the ones who can see through the nonsense. In other words, the actual critical thinkers. And I've often wondered why it's that particular percentage or ratio. And if you look around you, and I've done this over the years, I've looked around me in my circles, and it's never really more than 3 or 4 out of 10 people. It's interesting. I wonder if that's just how we are.
I don't think so. I think that it gets socialized out of us. One of the things I write about in my book is, again, as a parent, we all go through this, where your kid has just pushed you past the line and you wind up saying, because I said so. I want you, put your shoes on you got to put your shoes on, we got to go to school. I don't want to put my shoes on. Put your shoes on. Why do I have to put my shoes on? Because I said so. Okay. That because I said so winds up becoming the core belief system for a lot of people.
Yeah, but it is also practical, though. Sorry for jumping in, Peter, but it is practical. You're going to run late if you have to answer every question.
100%. I'm not saying that it's not. What I do think, though, is that it becomes the default for a lot of parents, and I think that, and believe me, I was no saint as a parent. So I'm sure that if my daughter watches this, she could think of all kinds of violations in my ability as a parent, because you don't get an instruction booklet. When you get a kid, you don't get an instruction booklet. Yes, there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there in the world, and yes, there's a lot of people you can lean on, but every case is individual and it's unique, and that's what makes kids great and brilliant and fantastic. But that, because I said so, winds up becoming a default. I was surprised that he said a third, though, because in my experience, it's much lower. I don't think that we would be in much trouble.
That's quite dark.
I don't think that we would be in much we would be having as many problems as we have right now if it was a third. That would be great if it was a third. But yeah, I don't know. I just think it's look at the amount of I don't know.
Okay, well, let me jump in quickly again and ask you this question. Why were you and I able to see through the whole COVID thing in 2020, but so many around us weren't able to?
because we were thinking, because we were using our critical ability to compare what we saw with what we knew and couldn't reconcile it. It's the cognitive dissonance that we had that triggered our ability to ask more questions. Cognitive dissonance, a lot of people think that it's bad. Cognitive dissonance is our wake up. It's our alarm. It's our wake up call. It's it's if you put your hand on a stove, it burns you and you pull your hand back. Cognitive dissonance is telling you something that I know doesn't match something that I'm experiencing. And then you have to reconcile that. A lot of people reconcile it by changing their reality, and then other people reconcile it by challenging their reality.
When I was growing up, my parents always taught me to question everything. And in actual fact, I mean, I grew up in a church Sunday school home, and I remember my mom, when I was young, she said, it's actually biblical. And she referenced a verse, I don't know where it is in the Bible, something along the lines of test everything or test my word or something along those lines. And I'm sure somebody listening to this will be able to verify if that's correct or not. I might even have the
I should be able to quote it because it's in one of the chapters that I just finished. And when you're writing a book, you're so overwhelmed by all of the things that you've written that sometimes I think it's Jesus. No. Trying to remember the exact, I should know this off the top of my head, and I don't. I'm embarrassed, but you know what? I'm going to go make sure that I do know it after this podcast. There's people who are watching the podcast right now who are screaming and they're throwing stuff at the screen because they know
apologies.
Yeah.
But the point is that I grew up being told to question everything.
Thomas. Oh, one of them was doubting Thomas. Jesus reappears after he's been crucified, and he's talking to Thomas, and Thomas says, "I don't believe you're here." And he said, "Well, he holds up his hands, I think, and he asks him to test the stigmata. Stick your finger in the hole in my hand." But basically, what he's telling him, he's telling Thomas to test the reality of what's in front of him. And so, people who don't believe in the transcendent apparition of Jesus are going to criticize the example. But the point that's where we get the expression a doubting Thomas. A doubting Thomas is somebody who needs to be forced to test reality.
But the point that I was making, whether or not you're a Christian, is irrelevant. The point is that I was taught from a young age to question things, and for me, it's absolutely natural to ask why, like the little girl with the river and the pebble.
Yep.
In actual fact, if you keep asking why, you'll eventually get to the utmost foundation.
Amen. Absolutely. 100%. That's the point. And the thing is that if you have a bunch of little kids in a classroom, and every time their teacher is trying to teach them something, the hand goes up and another kid goes, "Why?" And the teacher is looking at the clock. Again, this is the Prussian education system. The teacher's looking at the clock. The teacher's looking at their lesson plan. The teacher knows that they need to test all of these kids on this stuff at the end of the week. So standardized testing, bells, all of these other things interrupt. If you can imagine 5 kids sitting around a circle with a teacher sitting in a field with a picnic basket, and the kid asks why, the teacher may spend the rest of the day or the rest of the week explaining why, right? But because of the Prussian education system, and the teacher knows what the test is going to be at the end of the week, and the teacher knows that the teacher only has a certain amount of time, then the teacher is going to shut that kid down.
Yes. Because I said so.
Because I said so, right? Exactly. You get it.
Because there is a certain amount of curriculum that the teacher has to get through, And if she has to keep answering why the whole time, she'll only get through a tenth of it.
Right.
And I'm reminded now of that rather romanticized sort of illustration of the ancient Greeks sitting under a tree, talking about one particular point for a month.
Exactly. And then you have to ask yourself the question, is a person who spends a month asking why about a certain question less educated than somebody who can answer a bunch of pre-planned questions at the end of the week for, 40 weeks a year?
Well, here in South Africa, we've got a kind of, I don't even know, I don't know how you define it, but it's a question that I've asked a few times on my show, all right, and there are variations of it. So the one version of it is a bushman poor? Or another version of it is a bushman dumb? And the way of thinking about it is, if you were taken on a helicopter to the Kalahari Desert and dropped into the middle of the desert for a month, and there's a bushman near you, who's going to outlive the other person?
That's exactly right. I mean, I saw a ethnologist do a speech once, and he was talking about race superiority. And to your point, he said sub-Saharan Africans are absolutely the superior race in sub-Saharan Africa. Because if you took somebody from another part of the world and you dropped them in there, they wouldn't survive. And his point was that, racism, that races do have certain strengths and weaknesses, and to be in denial of that is just being dumb. But to your bigger point, survival is probably the ultimate form of intelligence, I think, at a certain point. I mean, that's many of the IQists will argue that, human beings are superior because of our intellect. And who's to say that bushman doesn't have a superior intellect?
But I mean, what is IQ anyway? I've had this discussion many times over the years, and you are welcome to put me in my place, but I've often said that an IQ test is really just a test to see how well you do in an IQ test.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
What's the practical application?
Sorting people in a very kind of Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller sorting box, Cecil Rhodes, where you can pick people for tasks that you have determined they're better at doing because of some heuristic that you've come up with. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means that that's what they've done.
I mean, I'm yet to see a real world application of an IQ test. I think it was designed by a Frenchman for a very specific application in his classroom way back when. I wholeheartedly agree. Like I said, I was told there was the head of the psychology department at UCLA lived across the street from me when I was 5 and 6 years old, and he gave me 2 IQ tests, and so that changed the way that my mother thought of me. Is what happened. And then I wound up getting put into all of these different programs. It had zero impact on me, other than my mother decided that I had to go into this program or I had to go into that program because of this thing that this test said. And ultimately, I wound up rejecting. I was put into all of these, what they call gifted children's programs. But I kind of flunked out of all of them. Like I just really wasn't interested in any of them. And I was much more interested in reading history books than any of the other stuff that was going on. And it wasn't until I was 60 that I realized all those history books were lies, but listen, Peter, I'm just looking at the time. Just quickly regarding the Kalahari Desert, I can't remember if I've asked you if you've been to my side of the world, but the Kalahari Desert is just above South Africa on the Namibian side. It's a very massive part of the continent, the sub-Saharan continent. But I've been to a game park there called Khalkhadi, and I suspect you won't be able to pronounce that. It's got that guttural sound. But it takes up a very small portion of the Kalahari Desert, but it is beautiful, absolutely magical. That being in that kind of desert and you see Bushmen there because that's still where some of them live today. And it's a very different kind of experience. The people are quite different, and nature is just majestic.
Yeah, it's great. No, I've never been to the Kalahari. I spent some time in Wadi Rum with some.
Where's that?
What?
Where's that?
It's in Jordan.
Oh.
It's in Jordan. It's where they
that's
shot.
Quite far away.
It's what?
That's quite far away.
Yeah, I was in Jordan. I wanted to go to Wadi Rum because it's where they made the movie Lawrence of Arabia. It's also where Lawrence of Arabia operated out of. But it's an incredibly wonderful place. And again, these people, the Bedu, are not Bushmen. They definitely drive Toyota trucks and things like that. But there's a certain part of their culture that they have not lost. They grew up in the desert and they live in the desert. And so I kind of understand what it is that you're saying, but people are different, and we all come from different persuasions and backgrounds, and we adapt. And I think that we adapt by using that logos, that critical thinking ability that we have, that we all share, that we all have. And so for one group of people to say that another group of people are not, that they're superior because of a test, is making an argument that you're measuring something that I'm not sure you can measure.
Well, it's like it's kind of like saying a pointer dog is superior to a Rottweiler. They both serve different purposes. They both got different strengths.
Indeed, I think that's a really good example. People are different, and that's what makes us great. Is that we're different, and I'm using
the word great. All right, Peter, I love chatting to you. I'm going to have you back on again. This is a fascinating. It's like a collection of topics. How can I follow your work?
If you just go to thedukereport.com, which redirects you to thedukereport.substack.com, that's my Substack. I also have I also have another website called Duke Report Books, where I have 900 of the probably the most important books that you've never read. It lists them all for people who want to catch up. If you're trying to figure out how the world really works, it turns out that there are many books and things that have been published, but they never wind up making the New York Times bestseller list. And so on the DukeReportBooks.com, you'll find 900 books with 1,500 word summaries. For over 300 of the books, there are half an hour to hour long podcasts explaining what the book is about and why you should read the book. For over 200 of the books, there are 5 to 10 minute video explainers. And all of my content on the Duke Report is free. And if you want to support me, though, you can become a paid subscriber on the Duke Report, and that will keep the lights on and keep the content coming. I'm finishing a book right now called Reframing Reality, which should be out for Christmas, and it will answer most of the questions that most people have about how the hell we got here.
Peter Duke, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you very much, Jerm.
Thanks for watching to the end of the video. If you got value from it, consider joining as a channel member, which directly supports what we do here. The link is below, and if you're hungry for more, here are 2 more videos for you, and we'll see you in the next one.